Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is the 111th session. I'd like to take a moment to thank the members of the Thursday Forum Steering Committee who worked hard to select topics for this session. In this second half of the year, we'll discussing some pressing global issues. Topics will include the US presidential election. It will be very exciting, next month. And the conflicts in the Middle East and the potential solutions. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the new Cold War in Northeast Asia, and the situation in Burma or Myanmar, among others. Today, we are starting with a critical topic, the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. This topic extends beyond just Korea. It's an international matter involving major powers like the US, China, Japan, and Russia. Our speaker today is Dr. Iain Watson, a professor at the Ajou University Graduate School of International Studies in Korea. Let me give you a brief introduction. Ajou University is located in Suwon. Suwon is around 1.5 hours from Seoul. Dr. Watson is an acting associate professor at Ajou University and earned his PhD and MA in International Studies from Newcastle University in the UK. He has taught politics at both Newcastle and Durham universities. And his research on Korean foreign policy, aid and multiculturalism has been published in various international journals. His book, published by Lotology in 2014, focuses on Korean foreign aid and emerging donors in Asia. He also has experience working with the NGOs in the UK supporting refugee-based projects. The title of Dr. Watson's presentation today is Reunification of the Korean Peninsula, National Identity Perspectives. Not only is the reunification, it has some significant meaning. To moderate today's session, we are honored to have Dr. Sandeep Kumar Mishra from India. Dr. Mishra is a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University's Center for East Asian Studies and is a well-known expert on the East Asian issues, particularly Korean Peninsula studies. He has worked with the various Korean research institutes, including the Korean National Defense University, Institute for Far East Studies at Gyeongnam University, and the Sejong Research Institute. Dr. Mishra is also actively involved in Track 2 diplomacy, focusing on peace and reconciliation. Dr. Watson will present for about 30 to 50 minutes, followed by an open discussion and a Q&A session. I encourage everyone to participate in the discussion actively, and raise any questions you'd like. Without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Mishra, the floor is yours. Today's moderate.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to be part of this exercise. I really appreciate Professor Kang for giving me this opportunity where I can meet with old friends, meet new friends, and discuss about important issues, because peace, reconciliation is a very, very important for all of us in our heart. We believe that any problem, any things could be, through reconciliation, we can overcome all those issues. Today's topic is very important. And I was really, I was going through the PPT files of Professor Iain Watson. He's going to talk about Korean reunification issue, especially from national identity perspective. As all of you must be knowing that Korea has been a divided country for more than 7 decades, and many of the younger generation in South Korea, and even outside, I think, they are not aware, they are not enough informed about the Korean nationalism, Korean identity issue. And many of them, they have been talking about what could be the cost of reunification. I came across and study a very serious study by Korea Development Institute, KDI, saying that if Korea has to reunify, there are going to be around 3 trillion US dollar cost which South Korea, largely South Korea, has to pay. But probably they don't realize what is the cost of remain divided. Every year, if you look at the defense expenditure of South Korea and North Korea, is huge. Lots of tension, lots of anxieties are there in both sides, and also how much every year they are spending their resources on other, you can say, trying to create network to deal with each other. I think Korean reunification issue is a very, very important issue, and that must be understood in all possible dimensions. I had an opportunity to give a lecture on reunification of Korean Peninsula from the rest perspective. Basically, I have position that the 3 years, the issue of Korean unification, one North Korea. At another level is the regional issue where 4 other countries which are located, if you can say, in the region, Japan, China, Russia, and even United States. So 6 countries, they are involved at another level. And at the third level, basically, which is basically international perspective, which I try to suggest, my idea was that since any response, any, you can say, positive things are not happening from these 2 layers, peninsular layers and regional layers, why can't create a network of countries which are not directly involved in Korean conflict, but they are having some kind of connects with both South and North Korea. For example, India could be one of those countries, Indonesia could be another, Pakistan could be another, because all these countries, they are having their embassies in North Korea also, and they are having good friendship and exchanges with South Korea also. So I think reunification is a very complicated issue. And I think the most important part is basically the issue of identity, which Professor Iain Watson is going to deal with. I was really impressed by his PPT, you can say, slides. And I think we are going to learn a lot from his discussion. So I'll stop myself when after his presentation, I have few questions and few comments to make, which I will do. So I will invite Professor Iain Watson to make his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will help the Iain with the presentation because we have some technical problem. He has technical problems, so I will I will share his presentation, and you know what I'm assist him. Okay, and it's a pity that his face is not very clear. Okay, so we try to try to fix it, but
it's a bit odd.
okay, but his voice is still very clear. So okay, so okay, let me try. Okay, here this one. It's okay.
That's
Okay.
fine, yeah. So I'll be able to scroll down. So check. Okay, so I'll need to. Do I have control over that? To go to the first slide. Okay. I mean, I'm not sure whether everyone's been given the PPT to have a look at. I mean, I'm quite happy just talking and just as a kind of discussion to do that. So I'm quite happy to do that. Okay, because that's a little bit further down. There we go. So a little bit further back. Yeah, there we go. So so Professor Khan, do you have control over the slide?
Yeah,
I think
right.
if I So, okay. So that's fine. Yes, I can see that. Okay, thank you very much. All right. So if it's okay, if I just say, if I could just say move the slide to the next slide, if that's okay, that'd be fine. Great. Thanks so much. Well, thank you. Firstly, thank you to Professor Kang for inviting me to speak on what I think we all probably see as an important topic: Korean unification, reunification. And I was quite intrigued. I think it's a very important distinction that Professor Kang made there between the words, the terminology, unification and reunification. They have slightly different connotations, and I want to draw on that a little bit, actually, today's presentation regarding this question of identity. Thank you also to Professor John, my colleague at Ajou University, for, again, putting me in contact with Professor Kang, have an opportunity here to speak to you all today, and also for Professor Sandeep's introduction to, again, this important topic. Let me also apologize for the state of the video. I don't usually look like this on Zoom, so, but it's as long as you can hear my voice, I think that's probably the important thing. So I'll talk for about 35 minutes. And before I start the PPT, I'd just like to give a little bit of context on this issue, because the context itself does provide an idea of where I'm kind of going with the argument here. And the argument, in a way, taps in to what's previously been said, but there's a kind of generational shift now going on within South Korea. Either that is a generational shift where the young South Koreans really don't kind of have an idea of what this question of unification, reunification is about, for whatever reason, although I think there are a number of identifiable reasons for that. But on the other hand, I'd like to also suggest that a lot of the talk about reunification, unification is changing in terms of the language and the assumptions of what reunification and unification is. And in a sense, it's been used as a kind of almost a generational shift going on. And one or the kind of the underlying thoughts now within South Korea is that those ideological conflicts between the progressives and between the conservatives, that's now been supplanted by generational contests now within South Korea, mainly as a result of Korea's so-called compressed modernity, that everything happens very, very quickly in Korea. But also, I think, for questions relating to national identity. And I want to pursue that argument a little bit in today's presentation. So before I start the PPT, my basic argument is that there are two schools of thought regarding national identity in Korea, and it's linked to unification. And by national identity, I'm essentially talking about Korean ethnic nationalism. Okay, it's a very strong perspective in Korea. Some scholars track it back to the March the First movement in 1919, the anti-Japanese colonial movement, in the sense that this is a kind of modern sense of nationalism which didn't really exist before the Japanese colonial period. I don't really want to get into those debates today. They've kind of been covered. I'm more interested in the impact and the implications of Korean ethnic nationalism. And the basic argument is that despite the fact that we have two Korean states, and no matter how many policies or how many formulas or how many models we have of what unification or reunification might look like, there is this underlying assumption that there's something binding Koreans together. And essentially, this is Korean ethnic nationalism. It's shared in both North Korea and South Korea. And this is argued to be a kind of a bedrock, if you like, for all those debates on Korean unification. This is the one thing that the two Korean states cannot disagree on. It's about this sense of Korean ethnic nationalism. It's about history. It's about something that all Koreans share in common. So the word often used for this is kind of restoration. So reunification or unification will be the restoration of a single Korean group, a national group living in one territory under one sovereign government within the Westphalian system of international relations. Okay, so that's kind of the image of what unification is all about. But on the other hand, there's an argument to say, in fact, that Korean ethnic nationalism is actually what's driving the two Koreas apart, because both Korean states, and we perhaps need to make a distinction between the ethnic nationalist issue and the state issue, is that both Korean states over time have tended to claim legitimacy over representing all the Korean people on the Korean Peninsula. So we can see this in the Constitution of North Korea and the Constitution of South Korea. So this is a literature that basically says for the last 50 or 60 years, and certainly since the division in 1945, and I'll talk more about my division question in a moment, both Korean states have tried to have the monopoly of legitimacy over the Korean Peninsula and over all Koreans. So this is manifested in many different ways. And as Professor Sandeep also mentioned as well, it's also a matter of regional geopolitics as well, in terms of the recognition that both Korean states are given by the international community. And that sometimes itself can cause a lot of difficulties. So over time, both Korean states have tried to make the other state a kind of foreign state, a non-Korean state, a state which doesn't represent the Korean people. Okay, and this is at most apex during the Cold War, during the authoritarian period in South Korea and also in North Korea. So we have a literature in international relations which talks about how the Korean states made each other foreign to each other, how they created another Korean state. The Korean state were the other. They weren't really Korean. They were puppets of the superpowers or something like that. So that's the literature essentially. That there's two parts of this. One, Korean ethnic nationalism brings the countries together. The other argument, Korean ethnic nationalism tears the countries apart because each of the Korean states is contesting each other for legitimacy over representing the Korean people. So I came at this argument, I came at this perspective a number of years ago, and it was actually reading a newspaper in about 2006, 2007, before I first came to Korea. And it was about the time of the kind of sunshine period. It was the second Inter-Korean Summit in 2007. So actually quite a lot of optimism around at the time. And there was a discussion that was reported between North Korean officials and South Korean officials, I think in the military actually. And the North Korean was doing kind of small talk and trying to get the discussions going. And there was a report that the North Korean said to the South Korean, what's all this you're doing in South Korea in terms of multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity? Because this was the year 2006 when the Korean administration in charge began to introduce official multicultural policies. And the North Korean official said, you know, it's going to make it very difficult for us to have any unification if you go down this multicultural route, okay, because we lose that sense of Korean ethnic nationalism. That's the one thing we can agree on, but we are all Koreans and have been divided for whatever reason. And that made me think a little bit about this question about where Korea is going, because a few years later we have multi-ethnic, multiculturalism really taking off in South Korea. And around about 2015, 2016, a whole new literature began to emerge, which focused on the specific identity of a specific South Korean identity. So this is moving away a little bit from Korean ethnic nationalism, which had essentially been the narrative of generations since division, to something a little bit more specific. And it was interesting that younger South Koreans began to define themselves not as Koreans, but as specifically South Koreans. Okay, so this is really changing the whole narrative of what unification and reunification is about, leading some to say that younger demographics are just not interested in unification anymore. They have no memory of it, no direct memory of it. We're talking about a generation which the grandparents and even great-grandparents now, as the generations move on, they're the ones who have memory of the unified period, but not this younger generation. So it's interesting that in 2015, 2016, a whole new literature began to talk about multicultural South Korea, modern cultural nationalism, post-modernity, all this identity thing, which is really taking off around about that time, built on actually quite a lot of optimism. So a lot of writers talked about how younger South Koreans have pride in the, you know, the economic development, the technology, the smartphones, the Samsungs, and so on, K-pop, cultural pop music, all that kind of thing. They were really kind of going for that, which is fine. And often a lot of elite governments kind of focus on that. But my argument in the paper is a little bit that this has been slightly overestimated. But what you'll see now is actually a challenge to that from the next generation of younger South Koreans coming through, millennials or Generation Z, we call them now. And ethnic nationalism is back, but it's back in a very, very different form now. And it's back in the form of wider regional issues, such as the rise of populism, the rise of anti-establishmentism. It represents something very, very different. And that's basically my argument in this paper, but that has yet to be tapped into. And a lot of this is the result of the post-2016 protests in Seoul, around about October, November 2016, where we saw the emergence of a specific South Korean identity and waving the flags and so on in Seoul, in protests about the corruption of Park Geun-hye administration, but that very quickly evaporated. It very quickly went. And you see a great interest in all things Korean history, ethnic nationalism. And I think it's rather, I don't think I say on the PPT, but it's quite ironic that when we have the inter-Korean summits of 2018, 2019, and we have Olympic Games in Pyeongchang and so on, great interest in Kim Jong-un from younger generations, same age, very different backgrounds. This peculiar interest in his sister. A few books are written, The Sister. North Korean singers were paraded in Seoul. We had the Unification Olympic team during Pyeongchang. So paradoxically, we get this re-emergence of a rejection of all things South Korean and a little bit going back towards Korean ethnic nationalism, but in a very, very different form. And I think that's something that we need to think about carefully, because this is a generation coming through now, and they're beginning to rethink what we mean by reunification and unification. And it's very interesting that Professor Sandeep mentioned this in his introduction, this question of the costs of unification, the unification bonanza or unification costs. And I remember actually there was a report from Goldman Sachs in 2009 which said that unification of the Korean Peninsula will lead Korea, unified Korea, to be the fourth strongest economy in the world. So there's economic dimensions to this, political dimensions to this. But I think the cultural, the national identity issue is really significant. That's one I want to look at today. So again, the presentation is basically divided. It's kind of quite chronological. I talk about division, I talk about unification, division of what, unification of what. I introduce nationalism and national identity, and then talk about some of these new trajectories which are beginning to emerge now, which I think we could look at in little more detail. Okay, so next slide, please, Professor Tan.
One more.
Okay, so great, thank you very much. Yes, that's great. So I do outline some recent events literally happening this year, which do suggest that the old assumptions of unification and reunification are beginning to change. And I divided this into changes in North Korea and South Korea. So a few I'll pick out. Firstly, in January, there are reports that North Korea is beginning to think about taking reunification out of a North Korean constitution and giving up on the whole thing, and just accepting that there's a North Korea and there's a South Korea, and they are very different from each other. Okay, so that would really change the parameters of how we understand unification if the governments start to change the wording of the constitutions. Kim Jong-un also talked about the bloodlines. That's very much a part of this Korean ethnic nationalism, the bloodline. And he talked in strange terms. I mean, I'm not sure the translation is correct. And again, that's always an issue with looking at North Korean and the translations into English. But he used the word clan. He said that South Korea is a very odd clan. And that word clan has connotations, okay? It has connotations of bloodlines, it has connotations of identity, and it's a form of identity which is not really, it doesn't really fit in to the modern concept of nationalism or national identity. It's very much pre-territorial, pre-sovereignty. So it's a very strange use of word, the clan. It's implying that we are the same as South Koreans, but we're not the same as South Koreans simultaneously, okay? It's a strange narrative that comes through. North Korea was also what this basically did, what Kim Jong-un reports of what he did here was basically to move away from his father and his grandfather in terms of the strategies of North Korea, to taking reunification out. And I think he dismantled as well the reunification bridge and some of the monuments in North Korea. That's a very, very clear sign. Not necessarily a sign of conflict, but it's a sign that North Korea has decided that it has its own specific North Korean identity. South Korea has its own South Korean identity, and maybe we just treat each other as foreign states. Okay, now it doesn't necessarily mean conflict. It actually could mean the opposite. But these foreign states can be normalize their relations, have their sovereignty recognized by each other. But it means unification's gone. Okay, so again, this creates this kind of scenario about what reunification and what unification is. Secondly, in South Korea, a few changes as well. There are reports that the Yoon administration is thinking about reforming or changing the 1994 formula on unification, which is the Kim Young-sam's formula, which has defined the nature of unification for now 30 years or so now. So that's to be a big shift going on. There are also identity issues in South Korea. There was the issue, I think, last year when the Yoon administration wanted to remove statues, I think, from one of the military academies that are being put up by the Moon administration to make people think about the kind of liberation fighters during the Japanese colonial period. And the Yoon administration disputed this, saying that these anti-colonial fighters are actually communists because they ended up in the Soviet Union and North Korea. So we hear a lot of that word communism come back now in South Korean discourse, which is very, very different. We haven't heard that for a long time. But it's communism in a very, very contemporary way. This is not a communism to suggest that North Korea is still stuck back in the Cold War. It's a very contemporary communism, very much tied to this idea that there are autocratic Eurasian states around threatening South Korea. So it's very clear what's going on here. The museums of history now, new personnel involved, beginning to rethink what South Korean history is and where South Korea is in terms of Korean history. And this is something that links to wider questions of not just identity, but also education as well. And this whole idea about legitimacy between the two states. And this is both an inter-Korean issue, but also a domestic issue as well, about which of these states is legitimate Korea. And not only that, which of these states represent a future unified Korea, and which historical trajectory each state has been on. Okay, so this is I wouldn't say a specifically Korean issue. This is something that we see in different parts of the world, that certain chronologies and certain histories are excluded to give the state legitimacy. But of course, that also becomes a regional issue with China and Japan and the Taiwan issue. But all the states in East Asia are constantly thinking about how they're going to write their regional history in order to justify and legitimate their policies, whether it's absorption policies or assimilation policies or territorial policies and so on. So that's certainly something that we see more and more of now under the present administration. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question of divisions, this is quite, in a way, quite common sense and quite sort of the chronology of division. So, and it's manifested and represented in different ways. So we have a division of, literally the division of families. Okay, so this is the first form of division, the post-colonial period, 1945. We have a division of land, we have a division of communities, we have different types of divisions. So when we talk about unification, we need to think about what's the division we're actually talking about. Division of what exactly? And this has implications for what a unified state might look like. So a lot of work at the moment, I've noticed, is focusing on, okay, if there is unification, then what about land ownership? So what if families get out their books and say, well, this actually was our land before the Japanese colonial period, before division, we have a land claim here. That's going to be a massive issue if there's any move towards unification. Land compensation questions, all that kind of thing. So division of families, division of family plots, division of family communities. We also have division in terms of Cold War division. Of course, that's the most obvious one in terms of the Korean Peninsula. We have division of ethnicity, division of nationality, division of territory, division of state. We also have post-Cold War division, because there was that moment when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. There was that sense, I think, in Korea in the early 90s that with globalization and unification going on in Germany, but the next stage is Korea. It's just a natural process of globalization. So there's different forms of division, different forms of convergence. So this slide just basically talks about the different types of division. So it's kind of chronological in that sense. The big thing I think that's happening now is that the DMZ, which is the kind of division following the end of the Korean War, essentially the DMZ is not just a Korean division, it's also being seen as a much wider regional division between a kind of Indo-Pacific region, which the Americans and South Korean governments really pushing, and a kind of Eurasian continental division between the blocks of China and Russia, maybe Iran, North Korea. Turkey's been mentioned, but I'm not sure how that's going to work because Turkey actually has a very complex relationship with South Korea. But certainly autocratic states on the Eurasian mainland are now seen to be kind of blocking the Indo-Pacifics. The DMZ is now very much a regional, potentially trans-regional bloc as well. So it's an ideological bloc during the Cold War, but also now a trans-regional bloc. So again, this is the classic interpretation of what this division is. Is it a division within a state, or is it a Korean division, an ideological division, a family division, or a trans-regional division? Okay, so I think in that sense, there is something quite unique about the Korean Peninsula in that sense, about how it seems to represent this kind of split this regional split between and Yoon administration, very much focused on the values, the like-minded states, all the cliches that come out with the administration, as opposed to North Korea and the axis, almost like a Bush axis of evil idea, which is very much coming through now in a lot of contemporary Korean foreign policy. So that's just kind of a summary there of the different types of division that we need to take into account when we're talking about unification. Next slide, please. Okay, so division dates. Yes, so again, this is very contested, okay, because not only do we have to ask the question, division of what exactly, but when did this division occur? And this is important for later on because the type of division and the date of division is also part of each Korea's national chronology and national history, okay? So when were we divided? When were Koreans divided? And it's quite significant that the first kind of technical division, I suppose, of the Korean Peninsula occurred in August 1945. So there's a little bit of dispute about when the dates, maybe August the 10th, August 11th, but it's very significant, of course, because this was the day after the dropping of the Nagasaki atomic bomb on the Americans dropping the bomb on Nagasaki. Very clearly, World War II was over. So there was this story, I think it's probably a true story, and it's in the memoirs of Dean Rusk, who later becomes the in the Kennedy administration top advisor. He was a colonel or junior colonel at the time, and they literally got a map of a National Geographic map, found the line of latitude, 38 parallel, and literally drew a mark across it because they argued that they couldn't find a natural division of North and South Korea, particularly as now the Soviets and the Americans were now in the region. So they literally got a National Geographic map and drew this line across. And in Rusk's memoirs, he basically says we were tired. Okay, and it's just the quickest way to draw a map because we were exhausted. It was late at night. We just thought it's simpler just to literally draw a line halfway across. Now that's maybe flippancy is a bit of a too strong a word, but that simple division, line of latitude, line in the sand in a National Geographic map, starts off a whole chain reaction of different types of division and gets into the mindset of policymakers that the Korean Peninsula, whenever you talk about the Korean Peninsula, it is a divided peninsula. So there's some debate about maybe certain couple of days after dropping the bomb in Nagasaki, you get this division of the Korean Peninsula on a map, the Soviets in the north, the Americans in the south, familiar story. And then you get other types of division as well. The formation of the two Korean states in 1948, where the division becomes a territorial border between two sovereign states which don't recognize each other, but you're recognized by their allies during the Cold War. You get the division in terms of a DMZ, post-Korean War. So the division is a physical division, clearly, but it's also part of an armistice system as well. So the division becomes part of an armistice system. And of course, the debate occurs, if we're talking about division, which one are we prioritizing? Are we prioritizing 1945? Are we prioritizing 1948? Or are we prioritizing 1953? Okay, so again, this gets to the heart of the question of what kind of division we're talking about and division of what, which again plays into a lot of national identity, national legitimacy contests between the two Koreas. Next slide, please. So the unification representation. So this is just a kind of an idea of the language that's out there, okay? So this is actually included in many of the various formulas and models and sequencing that we see or have seen over the years, certainly since the Sunshine period in the 2000s. So we have the various ideas that we can, what a unified Korea will look like. Would it look like one state, one nation, one territory? Or would it be one territory with two political systems and one nation? Or will it be one territory with two nations? Will it be two nations and one system? The combinations are almost endless, okay? And of course, one of the ones that I find quite interesting is the idea that you have a kind of a regional approach. And this has actually been made by both North and South Korea, that you have a kind of federation of Korea, or you have a confederation of Korea. And that brings in the big, important regional distinctions within Korea, within the Korean Peninsula, which go back to history. Before the unification period, the Shilla period, a long time ago, but it's still there. Still, the regions are still there within South and North Korea. So again, there was a dispute in the Sunshine period between this kind of South Korean version, which were kind of pushing towards kind of federation, and the North Koreans, which are more interested in the kind of confederation, because of course that plays into the idea. But when we're talking about political systems, we've got one system which is authoritarian, another system which is democratic. Okay, so can those two systems work within one nation? And this is very much, this kind of modeling was very much part of the Sunshine Period, the kind of sequencing, what comes first, do we do that first, or do we do this next, and then we do it the next one? And indeed, how do we even recognize when we've moved from one stage to another? I mean, who determines when the recognition of when these stages and sequences are even starting, never mind completing? Okay, so this is just kind of brief summary of some of the wording and some of the language, which has been very much out there. And let's not forget that when we talk about unification, it's still very much territorially based. Okay, the idea that you have a homogenous territory with borders, with a sovereign government, a sovereign country. And this is actually a very Western model, okay, of territorial states, okay, founded or put into the United Nations system in 1945. So, you know, both Korean states only became members of the UN in 1991, so after the Cold War. So that question of sovereign recognition and what this reunification actually looks like in terms of good old-fashioned politics and old-fashioned institutions and so on, I don't think there's any real consensus on that at the moment. And I think a lot of the work on that, I think, is looking for a kind of unlocking of how we can identify sequencing the stages, perhaps might look a little bit different from those that we saw during the Sunshine Period. So there's again transformation going on here. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of the dates, if you like, of the usual dating of unification. So we have the 1972 under Park Chung-hee, the kind of the authoritarian period. I think, again, as mentioned earlier on in the introduction, we need to put this in regional context. This is the time when the Americans were very active in China. It was coming towards the end of the Vietnam War. There was a détente between the Soviets and the Americans. So Ostpolitik was going on in Germany, the kind of West Germany, East Germany becoming kind of looking at better relations and so on. And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean unification. It just means better relations. And I think sometimes they can be conflated. You can have very good relations with another country, but it doesn't mean those countries are going to be unified. Okay, it's a very, very different process altogether. So 1972 was a kind of the well-known. I mean, clearly it was going on before that, but it's kind of the public one. And then you have the Sunshine Period, it's kind of a little bit of a break with the Cold War and so on. Then you have 1994, kind of post-Cold War, and this is the big one. This is the one that the Yoon administration wants to reform the community formula, and the Kim Young-sam, who was very much part of Korea is now globalizing now. We need to move on and move away from the Cold War. And then you have the famous period, the Sunshine Period in 2000 and 2007. And that changed the agenda slightly, because there we have more emphasis on, if we want unification or reunification, we've got to do it ourselves. Okay, the Koreans have got to do this. The great powers, the regional powers, at this time, China was rising economically, but it wasn't what it is today in terms of military capabilities and so on. The Americans were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan following 9/11, 2000, 2001. And there was this sense in both Koreas that, okay, if we want to do unification, now is the time we're going to get on with it and do it ourselves, because the big powers are now distracted. Even at the time Russia was becoming more assimilated to the West, it's very, very hard to believe now, but there were, you know, debates about 30 years ago that maybe Russia could even join NATO or join the EU during the Maastricht Treaty. So, you know, the times have completely changed now. But I think there was a moment here when the two Koreas realized we can do this on our own without big power interference. That's very much a big part of 2000, 2007, and a part of the liberal progressive movement as well. But there's too much foreign interference in Korean affairs, whether it's China or the US, and that we need to do this with a little bit of independence and autonomy. And as I mentioned later on in the paper, this is actually a crucial Korean mindset, okay? The idea of self-sufficiency, of autonomy, not necessarily isolation, because that's what happened in the end of the Joseon period, which led to various issues of Japan and Russia and so on, but a sense that we can confront these issues by ourselves, okay? We don't need the Americans or Chinese or Japanese or Russians to get involved. So a little bit of that occurring in 2000 and 2007. And that's basically where a lot of this kind of reunification development left it. And I just want to mention, as I mentioned at the beginning here, this term reunification, because the terms do connote different things. That unification is usually understood as the absorption of one Korean state by the other. Okay, that can come in many different forms. Usually the idea is that one Korean state essentially vanishes. Okay, so it doesn't East Germany, as East Germany disappears in 1990. Okay, so literally vanishes. So that's usually seen as a question of absorption. And to be fair, that's in a lot of constitutional issues as well. Reunification different. Reunification implies that you're bringing the two Koreas together slowly but surely. And that's why Sunshine politics is mainly about reunification. Okay, so we look at North Korea and there are issues of the human rights and the economy and so on, but they are still Korean. Okay, ideologically they may be different, yes, but they're still Korean. And we can bring the two states together without foreign interference. In fact, it's foreign interference which causes all these problems. Okay, so one of the big issue for the Sunshine Period was if we give North Korea a security guarantee, then North Korea will come to us and we can have reunification. Okay, we need to give North Korea that guarantee. The problem was during the Sunshine Period was that this is the axis of evil age of George W. Bush. So a lot of interference by the Americans with North Korea on that list at the time. That really upset a lot of Sunshine advocates who suggested that we're nearly there. And then we have this axis of evil speech and everything just goes. North Korea leaves a non-proliferation treaty, it becomes nuclear, the moment is lost. And that's very much a key theme in reunification, looking for those moments, those signs, those opportunities where you can get the two Korean states to come together a little bit more and perhaps reunify. So different connotations between unification and reunification in terms of the terminology. Next slide, please. So a lot of this period during the 1990s and the 2000s was based on a lot of analogies with different parts of the world. So the obvious one was Germany. The FRG and GDR when Germany was reunified. And again, that's a question. Okay, what happened to East Germany? All right, and there was that whole debate during the Cold War. But actually, we think of East Germany as part of the Soviet sphere of influence. But there was an argument, and archives have shown this, that actually the Soviet Union didn't really want East Germany. It was still Germany. And during the war, the Soviets and Germany didn't have a very good relationship. So it's quite interesting that East Germany was promoting itself as the kind of the major state of the Soviet sphere of influence, but there were reports that Stalin wanted nothing to do with East Germany. Okay, so East Germany had to perpetually legitimate itself as a country, not just to the West, but also the Soviet Union as well, which is quite surprising. So the same kind of processes and the same kind of chronology. The two Germanys were formed in 1949, just a year after the two Koreas were formed. So it's a very symmetrical process. And of course, the argument was that Germany unifies in 1990, October the 3rd. There's no reason why Korea can go the same way. Okay, just maybe a little bit later, but it's the same kind of process. Another analogy often made is the Irish question. Okay, a little bit more problematic for various historical reasons. And this whole idea that Ireland is a divided island, it's got Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and you have Southern Ireland, which is a republic. So unification of Ireland is bringing down the borders between North and South, and you get unification of the island of Ireland. That's one of the big issues, of course, of the EU and Brexit as well. But on the other hand, there's a problematic argument here, that certainly in Irish politics, a lot of Republicans within Ireland say, well, actually, the Republic of Ireland is not really a true island. It's a creation of Britain, of colonial Britain. So a true unified Ireland would have to start all over again and not just be a continuation of the Republic of Ireland. So again, I think we can learn a lot from that model in terms of Korea, that when we talk about a Korean unification, what is the state we are talking about? Is it unification on North term or South terms? Is it the bringing together of two Korean states to form a third state? Okay, what will that look like? Is it the unified state tracking back all the way to the moment of division, or tracking back to the moment of Japanese colonialism? Where is this unification, and what timeline is this unified state going to be placed on and going to be put on? Which again, I think we can learn a lot there from the Irish model, and just various kind of the language that's used, partition. One of the interesting things I found in Korean politics, that the word succession is not really used that much. In other words, the idea that if each of the Korean states believes that it represents the whole of the Korean peninsula, you'd think in international politics that it would see the other Korean state as breaking away, as succeeding from that Korean state. But we don't tend to see that language on the Korean peninsula, which I think itself is perhaps quite significant to show perhaps the uniqueness of the Korean model here. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've already kind of mentioned it a little bit, just very briefly, that the question of chronology and timeline. Again, this is a very contested issue between the progressives and the conservatives about, if we're going to talk about South Korea and unification, then what is the timeline? Is South Korea the real Korea? And if it is, do we actually need unification if South Korea is the Korean state? Or is South Korea incomplete, but it requires completion in terms of the whole Korean peninsula? And if that's the case, then South Korea is not the legitimate Korea, not yet. It's halfway there, but needs to be completed. And of course, that brings the question that if South Korea is not a legitimate Korean state, then how can we have diplomacy between the two Koreas if they don't see themselves as legitimate states on a particular chronology or timeline? Okay, so this is one that's very much a part of the area of IR called critical geopolitics, which is looking at these questions of how each state over time has tried to legitimate itself. And those processes of legitimation have actually made unification very, very difficult, because neither state has really been able to legitimate itself because of these different timelines and because of these different chronologies. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, mentioned at the beginning, so I'm just going to go over this. So ethnic nationalism has been the big one. Okay, the idea of the restoration of Korea has come through this question of ethnic nationalism. So again, I'll mention that a little bit later. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so again, very briefly, when we talk about nationalism, we have different kinds of nationalism. So we have the kind of the question of is nationalism part of human nature? We have questions of ethnic nationalism, democratic nationalism. Quite an interesting one that was used at 2016 protests in Seoul, what's called atmospheric nationalism. In other words, nationalism is very emotive. It's very visceral. It's a feeling. Okay, it's something that's just in the atmosphere. We can just feel it. And a lot of that has to do with flags. So flags play a big part in all this. Rather than the sense of seeing nationalism as some kind of ideology or some kind of construction by governments and so on. So nationalism is both very abstract, but it can also be something very real and very emotive. And we often see this in demonstrations when flags are waved, maybe even sports events as well. But that sense of atmosphere, music and flag waving and so on, it creates that sense of togetherness, that sense of nationalism. And we also have something called banal nationalism, where we are being nationalistic, but we don't know it. Okay, so it's in the minutiae of everyday life. It's giving signals. It's giving, literally the word used is flagging. We are flagging that we belong to this nation in terms of culture, in terms of dates, in terms of chronology, in terms of symbols and so on. So, there's different kinds of nationalism, but the nationalism I'm focusing on here is the question of ethnic nationalism. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, historically, these are the kind of the contests over what nationalism, the elite contests, if you like, of what nationalism is. So it's a very crude division, but I think it's a division that's definitely there within Korean domestic politics. So we have the kind of conservative nationalism, which is very much focused on the Republic of Korea. But the Republic of Korea is the genuine Korean state. In the constitution, it has its link to the 1919 March the 1st movement, national liberation against Japan. It also has a conservative heritage with the authoritarian period. It's very much kind of the ideology that the North Koreans are not really Korean because they're communists. Again, that links back to the recent question of the statues and the museums and so on. So this is very much part of the authoritarian conservative, the Republic of Korea is the state that represents all Koreans on the Korean Peninsula. Whereas the liberal progressive approach to nationalism is more about the people, the Minjung movement, which has a long history. And it's kind of a little bit more ambiguous, a little bit more ambiguity regarding the role of the Republic of Korea. So in other words, liberals often say that certainly during the Cold War period and during the authoritarian period, that we have to get rid of the authoritarian government because it's not a genuinely Korean government. We want democracy, we want representation. That's what 1987 protests are all about, for democracy in South Korea. It makes South Korea a genuine Korean state because it's a democratic state. However, we're not quite there yet when it comes to unification, because we need to include the North into this as well. And of course, this has always been a big issue for liberal progressives, to focus on democratic nationalism as opposed to authoritarian nationalism, but also to have a little bit more sunshine, a little bit more openness to North Korea, which of course has a very problematic human rights record, and North Korean regime human rights record certainly not democratic. So it's always been a tension between conservatives and liberals on this issue. The response from liberals usually is, well, the reason North Korea is as it is not because it's not a Korean state, it's because it's been forced into this situation from outside external powers. And if we could do this on our own, we could get North Korea to reform. Okay, we wouldn't have a problem. These problems we have, these divisions we have, are artificially imposed on us by external forces for whatever reason. Okay, so that's very much the debate between conservatives and liberals. But the contests again are over legitimacy of South Korea and which state represents the Korean people, as I mentioned at the beginning. And it's this contest between elites over ethnic nationalism, which I think is now changing very much as a demographic issue, a generational issue. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the kind of shift that's gone on. So around about 2015, 2016, there was this shift in Korean nationalism away from ethnic Korean nationalism, much more openness to multiculturalism, postmodern Korea, the music, the arts, very different kind of nationalism as opposed to the ethnic nationalism of old. And this is put in a lot of very interesting works in the book by I think an Australian academic called Emma Campbell, and she was writing a lot about this question of a specific South Korean nationalism. And I could see it teaching at Ajou and presenting in Korea that the younger generation were very proud of this new South Koreanness. Okay, so there was the emphasis on Southern, very distinct identity. A lot of that to do with the 2002 World Cups. That generation were very young then and now coming through. The music, the football, the popular culture, which can be exaggerated by a lot of overseas academics, exaggerated, and it gets a bit, a bit sort of takes us down a lot of rabbit holes and really doesn't leave us much more to discuss. So that's a problem. But it's certainly a part of a sense of a new South Korean identity. And that, of course, has certain implications. It says that South Korean youngsters are very optimistic. They're very proud. National pride is very, very big. This was the kind of shift that Emma Campbell was tapping into. Next slide, please. Okay, so the implication of unification, I think this was mentioned earlier in the introduction, but it basically means that younger demographics not interested in unification, not interested in ethnic nationalism, they have no link whatsoever to a unified Korea before 1945. Of course, there's an other argument that, Korea was unified during the Japanese colonial period. It was colonized, but it was still unified. So again, make a distinction in the chronologies between a unified Korea and a unified Korea under colonial rules. So there, that relationship is quite problematic. But certainly in my research and talking to young South Koreans, yes, they learn this at school. Yes, they learn the textbooks at school, but they're more concerned with their everyday lives, getting a job, getting a degree, getting their own kind of family security, the economic security, the job security. That's what they're focused on. So it's kind of paradox where younger South Koreans are proud of what South Korea has done, but also at the same time feel very vulnerable. And that vulnerability has led to a lot of apathy about unification. That's something their grandparents talk about or the parents talk about. It's not something that really interests them. Okay, so walking into Seoul, going to school, going to university, they're not going to be talking about ethnic nationalism or Korean unification. It's not going to be happening. I think there's a report recently by one of the think tanks in America that the average younger South Korean thinks about unification maybe once a month, twice a month, and even that's because they have to, because it's what they're learning at school. Okay, so a big shift that's gone on. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few problems with this idea of this new South Korean nationalism, and I think we saw this again in 2016, the protests, but that sense of optimism that Emma Campbell taps into in 2014, 2015, literally a year later, 2016, we see that that's not optimism at all. There's a lot of younger South Koreans who are very cross. They feel that their government has let them down. They feel disenfranchised. And this is very much part of the protest against Park Geun-hye. And when the Moon administration, Moon Jae-in administration came in, a massive turnout and a lot of votes, there was a great hope that, now we can really move South Korea forward. And it's very interesting that it was, again, specifically South Korea that the younger demographics were talking about. On the streets of Seoul, I remember going out there a few times and the candlelight protests and just getting an idea what people were talking about. They were talking about South Korea, proud of South Korea. They want their country back. No talk of North Korea, nothing like that. They want their country. They want South Korea. That's actually a very populist phrase now. I want my country back. It's a lot of populists now are using in the EU and Europe and so on in my own country. So we can see the signs which are emerging here. But then you have disenfranchisement and a lot of disillusionment coming in with the Moon administration, as many believe that the Moon administration used this opportunity to reignite the old ethnic nationalism, the sunshine period, the 386, the 486 generation. There was talk about how the Moon administration had upset many athletes because they wanted a unified Korean team at Pyeongchang. So many South Korean ice hockey players, I think it was an ice hockey team, they had to give up their place to North Koreans. They were very upset about that. And it is an example where the government is not listening to the younger demographics. Okay, they're going ahead with this opportunity now to get Korean unification going again, and they're forgetting the very people that got them into power, this younger candlelight protests on the streets. So a lot of disillusionment, a lot of apathy. And I think a distinction has to be made because a lot of the younger demographics are not depoliticized. They're absolutely fascinated and absolutely very, very politicized, but they don't have any mechanism to make things happen with that politicization, apart from things like social media, Twitter, gaming, all that kind of thing. So again, that's a big part of this rise, if you like, of recurrence or resurgence of ethnic nationalism. But it's a very individualized ethnic nationalism, and it's a very anti-establishment ethnic nationalism now beginning to occur. And maybe it's because of the protest in 2016, maybe because it's COVID. I don't think enough research has been done on this at the moment in South Korea. It's why I think we can tap into this a little bit. That if this rise of ethnic nationalism interest or rise in populism is emerging amongst those in the late teens, early 20s, then what does that mean for unification? Because when we think about unification based on ethnic nationalism, we're thinking about a specific generational understanding and contests between liberal progressives or between conservatives and so on, those ideological contests. Whereas for many writers begin to observe this now, but the real contests now are between generations. Okay, so again, there's always a danger in many, and I think the Moon administration kind of exemplified this strain. But you can very easily slip a kind of a progressive party when it talks about we are the people and want to promote the people through an ethnic nationalist lens. That can very quickly slip into a kind of Trumpian language of we the people against the establishment. It can unleash certain forces. And I think this is a trend we see across the world at the moment, where liberal progressives, when they talk about the people, the people who follow that can very quickly slip, and the word people becomes very populist and very exclusionary and very anti-establishmentism. And that's, I think, something we haven't seen yet in South Korea. There is an argument to say that South Korea is on the verge of this now, and that's very dangerous for democracy. A lot of writers saying that South Korea has hit a democratic ceiling, its institutions are now being challenged by this rise in populism. I don't see that. I think that's grossly exaggerated. I think, on the contrary, the very fact that many young people are looking at this issue and looking at populism and having a little bit of sympathy for the great leader theory for authoritarianism is precisely because they have the comfort of living in a democracy. Okay, and this allows them to do all this. So I don't think there's any danger in terms of institutional democratic issues, which is always linked to this identity question. But I do think it's something we have to look at, because when people begin to graduate and get into work and so on, and a lot will get into political power at some point, although that's another problem that a lot of younger South Koreans have, that they can't get into Congress, they can't get into the National Assembly. I saw data the other day. I think there's only 14 or maybe less than 14 members of National Congress under the age of 40. Okay, whereas in other parts of the world you have prime ministers and presidents who are in the mid-30s or early 30s. So that's a big generational issue, I think, in South Korea, but we have to keep an eye on, because that's the kind of thing that generates exclusion, generates the sense of despair, and can link to populism and re-bring ethnic nationalism back in again. But rather than being a positive for unification, can be seen to be a more destructive influence. Okay, so I think that's, at the moment, that's something that we need to keep an eye out in South Korea. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. I have to kind of cover this a little bit previously. Actually, if you can go through the conclusion now, Professor Kang, that would be great. The final slide.
You mean next?
Yes, next. Thank you. Yes,
Okay.
yes. To the conclusion, that would be great.
Conclusion. Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
So-
Thanks. I think it's a couple of slides on. Next slide. Yes, that's great. Thanks. So I think this again is the professor mentioned at the beginning that there are different dimensions to unification. There's the geopolitics, there's the liberal, progressive, conservative relationship, the contest between the Koreas over legitimacy. They all feed into this, and a lot of literature on that. But I think the one that to me is the interesting one is this tension, this demographic tension between the emergence of a specific South Korean nationalism, which is still there, but also a specific South Korean take on ethnic nationalism, which is very different from the previous versions or previous mobilizations of ethnic nationalism, which were used in the literature to enhance unification, reunification, and also part of literature which said that ethnic nationalism makes it very difficult to bring unification because of the contest between the two Koreas. So again, as ever in Korean politics, there's a crisis emerging, in my view. But as ever, within that crisis, there are always opportunities. Okay, that's very symptomatic, I think, of Korean politics in general. And I think that's something that more and more people are becoming increasingly aware of as the next generation essentially comes through and becomes more involved and interested in politics. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much again for giving me this opportunity. And I'd like to conclude the presentation on that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Watson. I think it was really, all of us will accept that it was a very comprehensive presentation. You tried to cover almost all possible dimensions of national identity in Korea and how it's connected to issue of reunification of Korea. I think you very well described and analyzed how at one point of time the stronghold of ethnic nationalism, it had slightly changed, at least in South Korea, and where nationalism had become much more, you can say, multicultural, diverse. Though you did emphasize that still ethnic nationalism is important, because that decides, you can say, the issue of identity. And I think I learned a lot from that. But basically, when I was looking at your presentation, the few things which I came to my mind, that yes, it's a complex issue, and I think we need to go into most of these issues. But suppose if I have to answer certain questions which you raised, suppose first question you raised that what was divided? And I would say that a nation which was called Korea, it got divided because there is a history. Suppose uh, we must have studied Shin Jae-ho, a very famous scholar from Korea, who tried to reconstruct in a way. He wrote something called Minjok history, people's history. And people's history, he started history of Korea from Tangun. And actually, many of his references are from Samguk Yusa, which was written in 13th, 14th century AD. So he tried to, I'm not saying that that was a real past, but it was a very, very important constructed past in Korea, which happened in late 20th century, let's say late 19th century and early 20th century. And if you look at the territory of Korea, you can say, like in very general term, we say that Korea is a divided country, probably the only one language, one culture, one ethnicity, but still they are divided. Nowadays we talk about diaspora, like Indians, they are staying in Fiji and Suriname, and we try to connect with them, saying that Korea is like, so there's a very strong history of ethnic nationalism in Korea, and this got divided. Now, the second question you asked and basically problematized, saying that when was it divided? Simple, that it was divided when two external players, namely US and USSR, they decided to divide Korea. That 10th and 11th August 1945 night when Dean Rusk and Robert Bone Steele,
Yes.
they went
Yes.
to a room and they decided. It's basically, it's not that they decided, basically the US policymakers in general, they decided and Stalin agreed to that. So it's not that like you may have different dates when it was formally decided, when it was actually decided, when it was de facto, de jure, all those, but it was decided by two superpowers as per their own strategic convenience. Now the third question, you say that, like, suppose two system, like say saying that like say confederation and all those things, these are in a way semantics. The issue is that there are two states or two systems created out of one nation, and all these ideas of confederation or federation, these are basically proposals from both South and North Korean sides time to time, that what could be the transitional phase in a very long period of history of last 7 decades. Both the Korea, be it regime, states, or say systems, or people of these two Korea, all of them, they agreed on the goal of unification. Now, you're talking about 1972 when you talked about typology. I think 1972 remain till now the three principles of 1972. You mentioned in your presentation, one, that it will, like, the goal of unification is above all system, ideology, and uh, uh, state. Two, it will happen without any external interference. And three, it will happen in peaceful manner. So these three have been again repeated by 1991 Basic Agreement. Again, the same principle was repeated when 2000 Kim Dae-jung visited and had meeting. Again, it was repeated in when you're saying that 2007, probably you mentioned about, like say, autonomy and Korean people, they are going to decide. I think it was there in 1972 itself. Saying that 2007 something new happened, I think we need to reconsider that. So overall, I think, and I in my opinion, when we look at Korean Peninsula, this January, Kim Jong-un, he came out with a statement, and as you mentioned in your presentation also, he tried to change constitution also, and basically saying that the goal of unification is gone. Now South Korea is another country, a foreign country. We are going to deal with South Korea like that. But all these, you can say, political moves, I will say, all these technical moves, they are not going to reduce, they are not going to eliminate the basic fundamentals that Korean people who are having same ethnicity, who are having same language, who are having same cultural roots, and from unified Silla period up till now, at least from Koryo or say Chojan period, they have been one country. Saying that people day-to-day life, they're busy in their own, India is a big country. I come from India. Yes, I think in different parts of India, people are busy in their own daily life, livelihood and other things. But saying that they don't have sense of belonging, if you look at their literature, if you look at their religious texts, if you look at their you can say travel logs, if you look at their festivals, if you look at their you can say what you call, in India, we go to different religious important places, so they are spread across India. So all these at an imagination level, they have been there connected. So I'm saying that it's very, very interesting, and it's a learning exercise, the way you complicated the whole reunification issue, division issue and reunification issue. But my suggestion is that while understanding this is important, and it's a very, very learning experience to dissect all these differences, but at the same time, uh, should we also not be always aware that there are basic fundamentals which we need to keep in mind, and that's Korean people are one people, they need to be reunified. External players, they don't have any interest in reunification of Korean Peninsula. Even North Korea is not having, because if this point of time there is a reunification on Korean Peninsula, all probability is going to be on the terms and condition of South Korea. So ultimately, South Korea is the only country who is willing, open to reunification. All other countries, they are happy with status quo. So in that scenario, I think we need to create different mechanism. I even if younger generation are less interested in reunification, being less interested in reunification doesn't mean that they are denying their common national identity with North Koreans. So that's my submission. You may answer and comment on it. So I learned a lot. Thank you very much for presentation. I'll open now for others.
Okay, thank you. I mean, yeah, just a few comments on what you said. Then I think it's the phrase you used there, the sense of belonging. I think is quite an interesting phrase, but that can be manifested in different ways. And I do take your point that this sense of underlying sense that we're missing something, but there's something hasn't been completed yet. And that runs that's still there, that runs through. And I'll just make a general point and just a few specifics on what you mentioned there. I think from my perspective that some of the assumptions that have been used in the past are not going to be working anymore. Okay, but things have changed so much. But there's always this balance between that we need to be aware of the historical processes. And that's why I mentioned 1972 and 1994. And I think you're absolutely right on that that framework is still there. I mean, there's only a certain amount of combinations you can have with the wording, and that continuity is still very much there. But part of my original interest in this was that it's still not happening. Okay, so what is it but stopping this from happening? And for me, part of that was we need to problematize, open up these concepts and open up what it is that's missing. What's the gap? What are we not talking about? What are we not saying? So I think that was part of the motivation to do this, to open this all up. But I do take your point that the very fact that there is a divided, have a North and South Korea, is a daily reminder that there is division. Okay, that's not going to go away. That's still there. How that reminder is manifested, and to what extent people are interested in that reminder, that's another issue. Which I again, that's why I focus a little bit on the demographic issue. So your first point you mentioned on the question of nationalism, I think you're absolutely right. But a lot of the kind of archival literature and the books that have come through all the way back, and I think the distinction that perhaps we have to make, and I do mention this a little bit with the clan idea that Kim Jong-un talks about, is that there seems to be a shift from 1919. The March the First movement seems to be a very different kind of modern nationalism, as opposed to the sense of identity and belonging that was there before. And my view is that that's not a uniquely Korean issue. That's an issue which many countries go through with the industrialization process of the information technology, the media, but we have a sense of belonging, not just with our families, but with another 100, 200 million people. Okay, we share the same belonging. That wasn't possible in going back in history because it simply was the technology awareness was simply not there. So I think I do, and I draw a little bit on Eric Hobsbawm's work on this as a historian, talks about the distinction between pre-industrial nationalism and post-industrial nationalism, where you get nationalism matching a territorial space. But I do take your point that the Korean Peninsula is unique because there is a basic geography of the Korean Peninsula. Okay, and I think that's your comments there that came across, which I do agree with, and I would take that argument. Your second point on division. Yes, that kind of nature, and I think in the presentation I hinted that there is an argument that it was an arbitrary decision by two people in the Oval Office or the White House to draw that line, but certainly it was within the context of the Cold War. I mean, that's very clear with the Soviets coming in, having defeated Germany, then moved the shift to defeat Japan. They are there in the Asia Pacific now. So I think very much the Cold War context is there. And I think there is an argument to say that that's what it was. It was a Cold War division, which we see in other areas of the world at that time. And it was, I suppose, the question I'm asking a little bit, was that inevitable or not? And there are, I would still argue that there are different kinds of division, but that's certainly the original division. But there was a division into two territorial states, which in that period between 1945 and 1948 is quite an interesting one, where there was a division or a partition, but North and South were not recognized states. There wasn't a DPRK or an ROK. They were partitioned territories of a previously unified territory. And my view is that that did make a difference. Once each country became sovereign and recognized by other nations, that's a different kind of division than a simple partition of a territory. So I think there's a slightly different connotation, and also with this question of I mean, again, this debate occurring in South Korea: Liberation Day, Independence Day, March the 1st Day, Hangul Day. These are important dates in the sense of shared Korean history, but each Korean state emphasizes different foundation days and different kind of narratives, if you like, of their own particular national history as a specific sovereign state. So I think that's, and again, with the armistice system, I think that's another different kind of division. But I do take your point that the original decision was by Bone, Steel, and Rusk. That was it. That's where it comes from. That is in the Cold War context. And I think you rightly say in terms of US foreign policy. Okay, so I think I take that. But I think the manifestation of the vision does impact on how we think about unification, or bringing a territory together, bringing two sovereign states together, dismantling the DMZ, a lot of work on the peace parks and the DMZ and the connections there. That has slightly different implications maybe for understanding of the division. I think the other point you raise here about the yes, in 1972, I think absolutely right. Yeah, that's I think a point I raised just a few minutes ago on that. I think that's the starting point. It's still there. It echoes right through. And I think that's where the German analogy very much comes in here. I mean, it was interesting that there was a lot of criticism of Park Geun-hye in 2014, her first major foreign policy speech outside Korea. And she makes a speech in Dresden in unified Germany. And of course, the North Koreans are really, they took that very badly, because that has a lot of connotations, that Dresden is no longer an East German city. East Germany vanished. Okay, so I think the German analogy is can be taken wrongly sometimes, but I think it's still very significant in terms of Cold War and the implication of the Cold War and the Ostpolitik period. I think that does run through the cooperation, the détente, and this interesting thing we see now in East Germany called nostalgia. But a lot of younger generation in East Germany, or kind of middle-aged East Germans now, have a nostalgia for the Germany they grew up, which was a GDR. Okay, so that could be a kind of an interesting avenue to think about, should a unification ever occur. But maybe the question of nostalgia for division might suddenly occur. Who knows? But certainly, if we take the German model, that's certainly a possibility. So I think overall, I would very much, the one that really stands out in my view as a Cold War question. We cannot ignore the situation to the external forces on the Korean Peninsula. Oh yes, and the final point you raised, I actually agree that 2007, the summit talks about Korean autonomy. I think that's there, absolutely, 1972 and 94 and 2000. But it seems to me there's a slight more emphasis on that, because there was a moment, I think, in 2006-7 with America involved in the Middle East, with China not the threat that it is today. There was that sense of opportunity. And I don't think that sense of opportunity was there in 2000 or 94 or 1972. So again, the context was slightly different. But I agree with the fundamentals. Yes, this is all about a Korean issue, and the external powers should stay out of this. And that's a trend that I think we can track back to 1972. So I would concur with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Watson. Now, floor is open for questions and comment. Professor Mikioshi, I think we need your comment or question.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Okay. 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 Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Professor Sandeep and Professor Watson. So I'm kind of overwhelmed with presentation by Professor Watson and also the Sandeep's comments. Yeah? But anyway, I'm trying to make sense and from what I heard. But anyway, so nationalism seems to be the very important issue, right? Nationalism, and of course, in the history, there are lots of different kinds of the nationalism and the ethnic nationalism. It has a long history. And anyway, I'm just wondering. I'm kind of comparing. I'm comparing what is happening in South Korea and Japan. And in Japan, now the basic issue is between globalism and nationalism. globalism, nationalism. But I don't subscribe to this nationalism. I would say this is a patriotism, globalism and patriotism through many issues like COVID-19 and the vaccine issue, and also the U.S. domination and all things. Yeah? So I'm just wondering whether there is any parallel.
Sir, may I intervene a bit? Actually, Professor Mikio, you see, patriotism is an idea which talks about citizen and state relationship. Okay, and a country like your.
For me, patriotism is based on the love for the, how they say, maybe the landscape, maybe a local scenery, yeah, and maybe based on local community. I think but anyway, and how they say, so that now in Japan, many people are now realizing the side effect of globalization. So with the idea of globalization comes with what is called maybe cosmopolitan citizens or whatever. Now in Japan, there's a kind of a reaction to this trend. So the people are now feeling about maybe returning to nationalism. And I would say this is a patriotism. And because the globalization is kind of the, how they say, taking over the sovereignty in Japan, and the Japanese government cannot decide what are the important things about the country. And many people are now going back to tradition and the traditional culture, traditional values of Japan. Yeah? For me, that is not necessarily the nationalism and in the what they say exclusive type. For me, I'm prescribing to how do you say? Maybe I can say it's a kind of inclusive nationalism that can coexist with the nationalism of the neighboring countries. Yeah? For example, maybe Korean nationalism or Chinese nationalism. But as I say, I feel more comfortable to use the patriotism based on the love for the land. Land is not abstract one, but more concrete one. And the mountain, rivers, and the beach, and the people's way of life, and these concrete ones. So I'm just wondering whether is there such tendency in South Korea. South Korea also, I think, quite a lot of globalized, right? And then the globalized people, and they maybe the young people especially don't have the strong sense of maybe their own ethnic identity, right? Then they are more familiar, more feel comfortable with maybe global citizens, cosmopolitan citizens. And on the other hand, maybe North Korea maybe seems to be maybe very different from the globalization, right? Of course, economically and ideologically, whatever. And there might be the argument, maybe from the North Korean side, maybe they may say, and we are the one who how they say, have kept the Korean tradition. Maybe although and they adopted the Marxism, communism, but on the other hand, I think they may claim, right, and they are the one who kind of protect it and safeguard the Korean tradition historically. And then on the other hand, the southern part, that one they are maybe just they become the slave of the capitalism, and including globalism and neoliberalism, whatever. So I'm just quite interested. Is there any thing, and maybe in Japan now this is increasing the trend and the division between the globalists and another one. Someone say this is a nationalism, but I would say patriotism. And just I'm curious, are there some similar situation? And then maybe if those young people maybe and more conscious about their own tradition, then maybe and the ethnic identity maybe revived. Yeah. And also maybe another thing is that I heard these days young Korean people, they are coming to Japan to seek jobs. And for them, and working in Japan is very comfortable, very comfortable. And maybe it's not so competition. Society is not so competitive like in South Korea, in Japan. So maybe if they can speak Japanese, then maybe they can be employed rather easily, and then they can easily settle down in Japan. So this means also there's a kind of the historical tie between Japanese people and the Korean people, irrespective of the unfortunate history, of course, by Japanese colonialism. But maybe it may be good to think about maybe nationalism issue in Korean Peninsula, maybe also including maybe from the perspective of the maybe whole of the Northeast Asia, including Japan, particularly maybe Japan. And as you know, the Japanese emperor family, they are the descendants of the Pekche ancient. So some people say Japan is the second Pekche dynasty. Yeah, and this is quite interesting, right? And Pekche's maybe history and those things, all these actually, and also Japanese maybe emperors story. Those are taken from the kings of the picture, right? And these things. So I'm just thinking about maybe trying to, how they say, restore the maybe missing link between Japan and Korea. Yeah? So I'm very sorry. What I'm saying is not very focused, but this is just my maybe feeling after listening to both of you. Thank you very much.
I think good comment. Actually, what I was saying, just I will add, and then perhaps Professor Iain Watson can answer. Basically, my basic understanding was that patriotism is basically depicts more about individuals' relationship with a country, and country constituted by territory, people, everything. But actually, it's a more talks about more about your country. Whereas nationalism, I think, is also equally emphasized your relationship with other human beings surrounding you. So I think, yes, globalization could be contrasted with patriotism, but globalization could also be contrasted with nationalism in a slightly different way. So I think Professor Watson can further help us.
I would like to pick up on that question. So certainly in the 1990s, and certainly from a kind of European perspective, the words nationalism and patriotism had very different connotations. So patriotism was seen as something good and positive and progressive, but nationalism was very bad. Okay, so this kind of language, the kind of context, very different from a European perspective and East Asian perspective. And I think there is this distinction that nationalism is about this connection with people of the same nationality, whereas patriotism is about the institutions of the state. So we see this a lot in conservative nationalism, but they use the term patriotism much more, that you have your connection is with the Republic of Korea and the institutions of the Republic of Korea more than Koreans, more than a sense of nationalism. I mean, it's obviously tied together, but I think that's where we can see the distinction, okay, certainly in the Korean perspective, in the Korean context. And again, that goes down to the legitimacy of the two governments, okay? So I think from this perspective, you could see patriotism is more a kind of relationship with government and governing institutions rather than to Koreans. And this, of course, is why you're back to that constant dilemma about which Korean state and which Korean institutions represent Korean nationalism. Because if we bring patriotism in, which I think is important to bring this in, then there could be a big gap between the two. And that gap can be filled with challenges to state legitimacy and all the kind of debates we have between the domestic progressives and the conservatives. So I would agree with you, but patriotism is more about a sense of institutions and country. Nationhood, nationalism doesn't necessarily always match or have that same level of legitimacy issue. And so we can see this in South Korea. The first point made actually, this relationship between globalization and nationalism stroke patriotism. I mean, that's the the kind of the classic dualism, if you like. You can't have both at the same time. You either have globalization or nationalism. Patriotism is a response to that. It's a very divergent relationship. But I think what Korea did, certainly in the 1990s, was to say this is not a contradiction. Okay, you can have globalization and you can have even ethnic nationalism at the same time. Okay, so the early work on this in the mid 2000s was to say this is only a contradiction if you see this in Western terms. Okay, so you can have a sense of national pride and nationalism simultaneously with a globalizing and open to globalization outlook and positive outlook towards globalization. And I think we saw this in 2002 in the World Cup, ironically hosted by Korea and Japan, where we see different responses to globalization, embracing, confronting, managing, controlling, and that enhances the sense of national pride and national identity. So I don't think they're necessarily a contradiction, but the two can kind of work together. The third point raised there on the North Korean issue, I mean, I think that is what North Korea always does. It says that we are the original Korea. We haven't globalized. We haven't got all the new technology. We haven't become Americanized. This is who we are, and this is our link to the past. Okay, and of course that became a big part of the kind of the ideology and the kind of legitimacy of the North Korean state. It's that whole business about being authentically Korean and the real Korea. And South Korea is a figment or a production of the Americans during the Cold War, but the real Korea is north of the 38th parallel. But at the same time, there's a lot of literature about 10 years ago to say, well, you know, the common belief is that North Korea is a communist state. It's part of the old Cold War stuff. When in fact, North Korea, for many writers, is actually a kind of ethno-fascist state. Okay, it talks about racial purity. It talks about one blood, one nation. From a European perspective, that's right up there with fascism and Nazism. Okay, so it's not far left; it's actually far right. And this is how North Korea. There's lots of stories coming out about pregnancy issues and mixed race issues with Korean women and Chinese men, all that kind of stuff, and very horrendous things that seem to have gone on there to keep that that sense of purity in the bloodline and so on. So again, we can't underestimate that if we see North Korea as an ethno-fascist state, then again, that brings questions about what is this ethnic nationalism we are actually talking about, and what does it consist of? What are the positives and what are the negatives? And I think it's interesting, Professor there talked about the land. Okay, so again, we see this actually in recent environmental literature, a lot of the Peace Park literature, looking for kind of Pungsu corridors and Peace Park corridors to generate that sense of national Korean identity, to recover that from the artificialities of industrialization and American forced economic growth and so on. And that's all about land, looking for landforms. It's a very interesting part of the Peace Park literature that looks for this looks back to the white tigers and all this kind of stuff. So that environmental, that kind of green politics, that green approach to unification, to look at the water, to look at the land, and it creates another sense of, I was saying, the Korean context, not patriotism, but more nationalism, okay? Because in this sense, patriotism would be seen to represent these kind of two Korean states, which have been created artificially and imposed on the Korean people, and neither state really represents this underlying sense of ethnic togetherness, or, as the professor said, again, a very important phrase, this sense of belonging. Okay, so I think that's a kind of the green literature and environmental literature is quite important. And I think that point about COVID is also quite significant. I think a lot of this, the way that COVID was there to generate this sense of national identity, to stop people coming in from countries that had COVID and so on, that creates a whole new literature on borders, on border security, border control, and a sense of who we are. Okay, we need to protect ourselves. So I don't think it's any coincidence that once COVID goes through the system, then you see this rise in populism, you see this rise in nationalism issues and back to the ethno-nationalism issues. I think there is I'm not sure on the direction or direct relationship, but I don't think we can ignore that COVID period for producing this sense of identity which unfortunately many politicians can exploit, okay, and have been exploiting for the last 18 months or couple of years. But I think that's quite an intriguing issue. And of course, that also brings in the question, another form of nationalism in Korea is what we call techno-nationalism, that sense of national pride. But Korea invents all these vaccines, invents all this ability to respond to COVID very, very effectively. Very different from my own country, which I think has the worst or second worst record during the COVID era for deaths of COVID. So Korea really stood out. And of course, that again is a sense of national pride. That Koreans did it. They were able to manage COVID, very low levels of death, relative terms. So a form of kind of techno nationalism is another form of nationalism. So resilient nationalism is another issue. So, you know, nationalism comes in many forms. But I do think, to go back to the original point, we can distinguish it from patriotism, which is more about the institutions of the state. And for that reason, I think in the Korean context, more Koreans would perhaps find more in common with the sense of national identity rather than necessarily with the institutions of the state and the bureaucracy. But having said that, of course, we can't ignore the fact that a big part of nationalism was the democratic nationalism of the post-Gwangju era in 1987, which was all about reforming the institutions of the state. So maybe patriotism and nationalism do blend together at certain points, I think, in Korean history. Thank you.
I think now Mr. Kitty, but I think I will request both people who ask question and also presenter to be short in their questions and answer if possible, so that we can include more people.
Sure, yeah.
So, Mr. Kitty.
Hello, Sandeep?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Mr. Kitty?
Kitty, can make you first. He waited for a long time.
Kitty, yeah.
May I talk to
Professor Khan Mikio? He raised his hand first.
Right.
Could I go after him?
Is it okay for me to ask questions?
Yeah, please, you can ask.
Okay. And thank you very much for Professor Ian Watson. And thank you for your deep and wonderful analysis and observation research. And I have two questions, briefly, maybe. Do you have any concrete image of reunification of the Korean Peninsula by peaceful means? This is the first question. And the second one is it also possible to think that we could build peacekeeping regions in Northeast Asia, like ASEAN in Southeast Asia? And before we support the unification of Korea, we would support peaceful development first of the region. I mean the two Koreas, and when the when the two Korea develop peacefully, the time will come for the Korean Peninsula to be reunified peacefully. This is my idea, but because I thought about this from the suggestion by Professor Emeritus Mr. Wada Hideki at Tokyo University, and yeah, and I'd like to know your idea, would you please?
Yeah, I think having been to the DMZ a number of times, it's remarkably peaceful, and it looks remarkably easy to dismantle the installations and infrastructure up there and just have people moving backwards and forwards. I think that's what's so fascinating. When you go to the actual border and see it, despite all the rhetoric and all the literature and the most fortified border on the planet, all this kind of thing, when you're actually there and actually see the fragility of it all, it's just so easy it's just there in front of you. And I think in that sense, that would be my kind of image of unification, very much as maybe as I just get older, I see it much more ecologically, environmentally based Okay, but I think, and again, it's part of the contemporary movement now. I think that people are more aware of the climate of the green issues, and to me that would be the image of unification. It would be a kind of post-industrial movement towards more awareness of climate change and environmental issues. I think there's something that environmental security issue approach that's quite interesting. As I mentioned, the Peace Park literature is quite interesting on that. But it does come across as it's so easy to do, and I think this came across in the Moon Kim summits as well, when President Trump crossed the DMZ, the blue sheds on the United Nations area. It's so simple, okay, despite all this rhetoric. So again, I think that's always in politics, that the division has created such a system and a mentality and a worldview that we're trapped in. And if we kind of break it apart a little bit, this whole thing could actually be quite straightforward. So relative optimism on that. But I think the second point you raised about timing. Okay, when is the right time? How can we recognize when that time will be? And one of the concerns I don't mention in this paper is that a lot of those emblems of sunshine and the Paju Observatory and the train connections at Paju and so on, all built preparing for unification, they do look quite nostalgic and quite old now. They're kind of a little bit rusting a bit, a little bit of a sign of a time that's passed and opportunity lost. But I think that the new opportunities will be out there. And I think part of that is that generational issue I mentioned. It could go the other way, but I think there's an opportunity here with a generational shift. But they might want to push this a little bit further and have a different concept of what they understand nationalism to be all about. So that's why I focus at the end of my presentation on the demographic issue. I think that's where the optimism could actually come from, a high possibility. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Kati.
Unmute, please. Professor Kitty, unmute first.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I have two short questions. The first one is that I suspect that the recent development in geopolitics, particularly the war in Ukraine, whereby North Korea supply weapons to Russia, and Kim Jong-un met Vladimir Putin quite often, that might draw the wedge in terms of identity between North and South Korea. South Korea, meanwhile, supply weapons to countries like Poland on the opposite side as well. And in addition, North Korea also launched a lot of missile tests, as we do know, but I haven't heard you mention about that. And what I wonder, what is your take about this side of hard power? Meanwhile, North Korea classified as a hard power, while South Korean people, they think about them as the soft power in the world. Okay.
Yes.
And the second question, from time to time, we have heard that Korean leaders of both sides saying that we would reunify without foreign intervention, without great power intervention, and so on. I'm afraid it's just a rhetoric. How can that happen without other great power factors or impact on this? And I wonder what's your take about that. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So that's a lot of realism coming into what you're saying here, geopolitics of this. And I think this does link back to what I was saying about the DMZ is now a kind of division between these different regional blocks, the kind of Eurasian bloc and Indo-Pacific bloc, and that movement of North Korea. In fact, I think it went further than that. I think there was an argument to say that the North Korea-Russia relationship is almost very NATO-based now. They have a kind of collective security relationship now. But one attack on either is seen as attack on both, which is quite a big shift. And I think the Poland question, that was really quite a big shift in I think Korea's number 6 or number 7th arms dealer now. And that's very unusual for South Korea. Partner across the globe with NATO, it upgraded its NATO membership, or rather NATO partnering a couple of years ago. Poland and South Korea have actually very similar geographies in terms of their proximity to Russia. In terms of Poland, Belarus, and Russia, South Korea, North Korea, and Russia actually have a lot in common. Strangely, Poland and South Korea. So there is that geopolitics in there. There's no doubt about that. But if we track it through and see nuclear tests by North Korea, it all depends on what you see those nuclear threats for. If you see them as a direct threat to South Korea, then I would take your point. if you see those nuclear threats as a kind of preemption for any shift in the American administration, or a way to generate some interest in sitting down and thinking about things like North Korean recognition or North Korean sovereignty, then there may be some unintended consequence from that. So I'm not sure as yet whether this NATO issue and this Eurasian issue is necessarily going to be a long-term question for the Korean Peninsula. But of course, even if there are geopolitical issues, it doesn't mean necessarily that possibilities of inter-Korean relations might improve as a result of this. There could be some very strange shifts in alliances. And I suppose this is something that Henry Kissinger used to talk about as a kind of classic realpolitik diplomat, talking not about, yes, there are tensions, but there's also fluidity in the system. There's opportunities for smaller powers and middle powers to actually play a big leverage role in all this. And I think with a nuclear North Korea and an economically prosperous or developed South Korea, that the chips might fall in a different way, and there may be opportunities later for these kind of states to take advantage of the great power struggles, which they have done previously, as I mentioned in 2000, 2007. So I think that's a lot of uncertainty in that, but I think you're absolutely right to point out that at the moment, this is the reality. There are North Korean nuclear threats, there are missile tests going on, there's Russia, there's NATO, all this kind of stuff. But that's not to say that there are always opportunities for small powers and middle powers to take advantage of these moments if they really want it. And again, that comes back to leadership and the personnel involved and the timing of that, which links back to the previous point about the question of timing. That would be my thoughts on that. Thank you.
Madam Crystal?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this absolutely magnificent presentation. I'm from Hamburg, Germany, and I was born before World War II. So my whole life flashed just by for 86 years, from the division and de facto and then legal and currency reform and to today.
Yeah.
The one thing which has not been mentioned, but everybody knows, the German reunification occurred as a surprise, so-called surprise, totally out of the blue. Nobody expected it, with which I'm thinking now, you have wonderful plan A of all the things which have to be done. But if, for one example, and probably a unification of the two Koreas will happen, also totally out of the blue because of outer circumstances, what would be your plan B for what do you start? What do you have to do at the very first points? What is long-term reunification and what is immediate getting together somehow? So that is not a question which you have to answer now, but I assume that you are thinking about that.
Yeah.
And the other question I have is, East Germany had this so-called Stasi system, that is, everybody was trying to betray each other and so on and so on. And that gives us still problems today. So I'm glad that you are following what happens in Germany, in the United Germany, 30 years after. What are the questions now? And thoughtful people are beginning to ask, well, did Chancellor Kohl acted too fast with this and that? The currency was the first issue to solve. So those are my comments, and perhaps you don't have to answer anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I mean, the German question, kind of the analogies with the made with Germany are very strong in Korea, and that's one issue that it might just suddenly happen. Okay, no one predicted it. That's politics. I think on the Kohl issue, that for what I can read from it, that he wanted to take this again. It's very much like this kind of Korean sunshine. There's a moment that you have to take the opportunity, because this moment might close down. And all that talk about the NATO question and the deals of Gorbachev and all that kind of thing. I think what also is interesting for the Kohl question was the link made between German unification and European unification with the Maastricht Treaty a couple of years later. I think that was Kohl's big point, that he wanted Germany to be in the center of a unified Europe. So I think there's a kind of regional dimension to that as well, and that doesn't exist in East Asia. There's no regional organization for various reasons. I think it's a very interesting idea that this could suddenly happen out of the blue. Maybe sometimes by error or sometimes misjudgment, things happen. Who knows? A Trump presidency might create a chain of unintended consequences. Will be an interesting one. But I think the first thing that needs to be discussed is the nuclear question, denuclearization. Okay, so that seems to be the one that is the one that really should be the initial focus between the leaders. But the problem at the moment in South Korea is that there's a big shift in South Korean public opinion for South Korea to begin to build its own nuclear weapons, because they have a little bit less trust now in the United States. There's the issue of Japan and so on. And that a few years ago, that wouldn't have been thought of, but now there's a lot of surveys coming through with a lot of interest among South Korean population to go nuclear and to break with a non-proliferation treaty. That's a big problem for Korea as the more it gets involved with NATO as a non-proliferation organization. That could be a big issue for Korean soft power. So I think that has to be dealt with. And that, in my view, that whole idea of Korea going nuclear is still tied to that national identity question. Okay, it seems to crisscross different political parties here, whether it's an issue of sovereignty or power or independence or a lack of trust in the Americans. It's coming in South Korea. And if we're going to have any kind of unification or reunification, that has to be dealt with very quickly, because South Korea needs to keep its legitimacy with the international community. And if it goes down the path of going nuclear, it then essentially becomes another North Korea, which broke the NPT in 2003 and loses a lot of support. Because at the moment, Korea is trying to build a lot of support with European Union countries through NATO, Poland, and certainly a lot of Eastern European countries, and Germany as well. That would be a big problem for Korean soft power. So that would be, for me, the first stage, the denuclearization, get that sorted out first, and then you can move into the next areas of potential reunification. But yeah, there's always that possibility that it might just suddenly happen, and even the great powers are surprised. I think Gorbachev was very surprised when this happens, and a few months later he was under house arrest, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist within 14 months. So I think that was very unexpected. So this can happen. So it's a possibility. Thank you.
There's a question in chat box from Mr.
Oh, right.
Rebuka. He's saying that I think reunification is required. It's clear that it's important and necessary for stability on Peninsula. But he's asking, I wonder which group, citizen or government, is more active in the push for reunification?
At the moment, there seems to be a very, even within government, there's a lack of interest. I think certainly this particular administration, which I would suggest, maybe a little bit harshly, but suggest that it is entering the kind of lame duck period now. But it kind of wants to make its legacy. There's this peculiarity of South Korean politics, the 5-year presidencies, which makes it often very difficult to get continuity. And usually the next administration just inverts everything in the previous administration. So I think from the top down, there seems to be a lack of general interest in some of the rhetoric. Now, of course, we don't want to mistake rhetoric for what's really going on underneath. I mean, that's another issue. In terms of citizenship, again, it kind of links to the previous point made about the question of nuclearization. Okay, at the moment, that seems to be where a lot of South Koreans are focused on, but they just want to get this sorted out and have a nuclear South Korea and not really have to think about too much about unification because of the cost issue and the destruction issue and so on. So I think that's something that even a year ago we wouldn't have really been talking about. We've been talking about denuclearization of the peninsula, absolutely, that's always been there. But the idea that we have to think about the dangers, the possibilities that South Korea goes nuclear, that's something very, very different. Now, of course, there are some international relations people who say that's fine. Let South Korea have nuclear weapons, let everybody have nuclear weapons. Because it's the process of stopping countries having nuclear weapons which cause the difficulties, Iraq, Iran, and so on. Just let everybody, let there be proliferation, and then you have regional stability. Okay, so that's a very, it's a very criticized theory, but it's and very difficult to do in the real world. But there is an argument for that. But I would suggest at the moment in the South Korean context, that has to be dealt with very, very, very quickly, and then you can revisit this issue. But again, as I mentioned in the presentation, there is this concern that a lot of youngsters are linking ethnic nationalism and unification to a lot of disillusionment with the establishment and with the government itself. So maybe if we're going to unpick those relationships and kind of separate them a bit and build them up again, then maybe the grassroots NGO potential for unification. And that's why I think the civil society response is always the one that And again, in Germany, you could argue it started from the protests in East Germany in 89 and so on, summer of 89. So I think from civil society, that's where a lot of empowerment can come from. But civil society cannot deal with the nuclear question. That has to come from government. And I think that's where the pressure from civil society on government needs to be a little bit more focused now.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's no question more. So I have a simple request actually, because it was a very comprehensive and diverse presentation. May I request you that in 5-10 sentences, you summarize your lecture today and then say your last words in this presentation and end.
Okay. Thank you. So unification and reunification is not necessarily just about policies and politics. It's also about this question of national identity, which impacts and essentially is impacted by the whole debate on reunification and unification. And my presentation is basically arguing that we can't separate now these questions of unification and reunification without looking at national identity and how national identity now is changing as a new generation and a new demographic comes through. And my argument basically is that can create great positives and more involvement in politics from younger demographics on this issue, but there's also a danger that it can alienate younger demographics who use ethnic nationalism not as something positive or something to move towards unification, but in terms of more populism and anti-establishment politics, which I think can be seen as not just a Korean issue, but I think a wider issue as well. But I think in a sense, Korea has an opportunity here to channel this, because this is not something that's undermining democratic institutions. On the contrary, democratic institutions are functioning very well. They can function better. So I think the national identity unification question says something about unification, but it also says something about what South Korea stands for and what South Korea can do at these different levels. And I think something that we can take from that, because it's clearly at the moment a very significant part of the world and has a lot of potential implications, not just in East Asia, but also trans-regionally as well.
Thank you, Professor Iain Watson. I think I try to can say take my responsibility to you so that you can summarize your paper, your presentation yourself. It's a pleasure actually to listen to you. We learned a lot. Actually, next month, late next month, I'm going to be at Ajou University. There's a global forum.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, great.
Invited by Thongil Yangguwan. I'm basically actually affiliated scholar there. Anki Professor Anki Lo actually. So I hope to see you there.
I will see you then. Absolutely.
Yes, and this debate about reunification is really we learned a lot. I personally am really very happy to moderate this session. So thank you very, very much, Professor Khan. Now up to Professor Khan.
Okay, thank you very much. Today's speaker, presenter, Professor Watson, and today's moderator, Professor Sandeep. Just before closing remarks or something, I'd like to, if you allow me, I think the Professor Watson, I really appreciate your topic and your presentation on behalf of my History NGO Forum and as well as the Korean people. Okay, this topic is very important for the Korean people, reunification of the Korean Peninsula. There is a very famous song, okay? The title is Our Wish, Hope is Reunification, okay? Whenever we sing this song in connection with this topic or something in some event, and particularly national identity or nationalism, I think sometimes is like opposite to cosmopolitanism or globalism, but for the Korean reunification, I think will be a good connection, will play a role of bridge. And around me, some of my colleagues, they have visited North Korea in connection with some the common some identity or principle or something. You know, Professor Watson, have you heard about Dangun, the legendary founder of Korea?
Yes,
the
yes. Cool.
Main theme or the principle of Dangun's teaching is we call it in Korean 홍익 인간. Okay, 홍익 인간 is, can be interpreted like a devotion to the welfare and the benefit of mankind. So the other principles like Christianity, Buddhism, or something is quite different, but North Korean authorities or the leader, they emphasize like some promotion of like 홍익 인간 or 단군, the legendary, the theme or principle. So there will be a the main fundamental national identity or something, the both sides. So I think it will be very important. But these days I'm observing the North Korean situation, even though I'm not a North Korean, specialist, particularly 2 points. One is leadership transition, leadership. I think leadership is very important. North Korea emphasizing their legitimate leadership in connection with Mount Baekdu, They are emphasizing it. And South Korean leadership is sometimes against like a very hardline policy, It's these days, the current situation between 2 countries are 2 paths, not very favorable, these days. And the other one is education. Our education is quite different, Some of the contents or some approaches different. So I think I'd like to somewhat emphasize like this 단군, the legendary founder nationalistic, some principle or what are the barriers in this improvement to reunification. The development of reunification is, I think, the leadership and education, the 2 factors are very important, This is my additional comments. And I really thank you very much for the today's Professor Watson for your presentation, and as an expert, Professor Mishra, your moderation. And I'd like to announce our next program 2 weeks later, October 3rd, The speaker is from Canada, Alpha Education, and the title is Empowering Youth Through the Asia Pacific Peace Museum. They opened the Peace Museum some months ago, and I'd like to invite the representative of that Alpha Education to be a speaker. How to, make the most of these facilities for the youth education, particularly historical education initiative. And my forum, when I announce it, the notice, send the notice, I also include a community bulletin. So if you have a very important, some news or something you'd like to share with the other members, you can send me. I can share it with all the members. And one thing, some of you remember September 21st is the International Day of Peace, designated by the United Nations. So my committee members, we are preparing the statement, statement in connection with the International Day of Peace. And here, Professor Rebecca Delancey, she prepared the draft, and I'd like to get some comments from my committee members, and I'd like to finalize it, and I'd like to share it on the day of International Day of Peace, September 21st. So you can share it. And also, I heard that this month, September, some friends, their birthday falls on this September. So I'd like to congratulate their birthday. And here, Mary Etsuko Yonezawa-san and some other members, raise your hand, who are your birthday here? Oh, Sandeep, your birthday, No. Anyway, congratulations on your birthday. Happy birthday to you. And hope to see you next month, October 3rd. And keep healthy. Thank you again. And Professor Watson, and hope your the paper, your dissertation will be complete.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and to the moderator and the questioners. Thank you very much.
Up to late. Thank you, and okay, have a nice day. Okay, bye,
Bye.
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.